Exodus 23:12 says, 6 days thou shalt do thy work, and on the seventh day thou shalt rest, that thine ox and thine ass may rest, and the son of thy handmaid and the stranger may be refreshed. In previous About Jesus devotionals, we've discussed the fact that Sabbath law was distinctly given by the Lord to male circumcised Jews under Mosaic law, and applied to those male circumcised Jews and to their wives and offspring. The Sabbath was never a law before it was given to Israel by Jesus as law under Moses. You can read the basic code of Mosaic law in the Ten Commandments found in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 17, but the Sabbath was only referred to as law in one other account before Exodus 20, and that's in Exodus chapter 16, and of course by Moses. Before that, Sabbath is never mentioned by that name. There was no Sabbath law. No one was stoned to death for picking up sticks or plucking grapes on the seventh day, which we call Saturday. And yet there was a Sabbath principle. God had set the example in Genesis 2:2. And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And then the next verse indicates that this was much more than just a symbolic gesture. Genesis 2:3 says, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. But there was no law. There was no threat of capital punishment or any punishment for those not keeping the seventh day as a day of rest. It wasn't called Sabbath until Moses used that term in Exodus 16:23. The fact is, as one source puts it in this way, quote, according to the archaeological record, no contemporaneous archaeological or extra-biblical Near Eastern texts document a seventh-day Sabbath among the Israelites prior to the Exodus. Material evidence from Egypt, Canaan, or early Israelite sites yields no definitive proof of Sabbath observance before Moses, end quote. I believe that it's likely that God's people observed a general day of rest on the seventh day because Exodus chapter 16 seems to indicate that they were familiar with the concept. But again, if that is true, it still is not a law, not until Moses. And since Jesus fulfilled the law in his life, death, and resurrection, Christians have maintained the worship of the one true God of the Bible and have maintained his moral law. But of the Ten Commandments, only one law was never repeated or taught by the apostles, and that is the Sabbath. Jesus kept the law and kept the Sabbath because his earthly life was still under Mosaic law, but he also challenged unbiblical practices attached to Sabbath law. And after his resurrection, Christians began meeting for worship and fellowship on the first day of the week, which we call Sunday, according to Acts 20 verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2, because Jesus rose from the dead as the Sabbath had ended and the sun began to rise on the first day of the week, according to Matthew 28:1. And we're never commanded to keep a seventh-day Sabbath. For example, in Romans 13:9, where Paul lists the law, he never mentions the Sabbath in that list. And the only time the word Sabbath appears in the epistles to the churches is in Colossians 2:16, where we're told not to judge anyone regarding Sabbath days. So, a seventh-day Sabbath is not a Christian practice, but the Sabbath principle still holds true. And it is wise and commendable to take a day of rest, just as God did at the end of creation, and just as God required his people to do under Mosaic law. And I believe there will be a Sabbath observed for 1,000 years during the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ, in which the world will worship him as he sits on his throne in Jerusalem. In the meantime, don't let anyone judge you, as Colossians 2:16 says regarding Sabbath days. But do yourself a favor by following the model given by Jesus in Genesis 2 and in his earthly life by honoring the biblical time-honored practice of a day of rest. And it only makes sense to do that on the first day of the week as we have church with our families.